Hey everybody, it's the Jimmy Dore Show. I'm Aaron Maté, sitting in for Jimmy, and we're talking to Camila Escalante, editor with Causacha News and a Latin American correspondent for Press TV, and Michael Fox, Brazil-based journalist who is host of the podcast Brazil on Fire. And we're talking about these violent events in Brazil where thousands of people have attacked government buildings in protest of the new government of Lula da Silva and in favor of the now exiled president who Lula recently defeated, Jair Bolsonaro. And what I want to ask you about, guys, is the U.S. reaction, which for the first time, or for a rare time, the U.S. claims to be concerned about democracy in Latin America after spending so many decades overthrowing democracies and organizing coups and imposing sanctions to undermine elected governments, leftist governments that the U.S. wants to get out of the way. But this time, the U.S. is claimed to be on the side of Lula da Silva and saying they're opposed to these protests. And I'm curious for your thoughts as to why. And here's a clip from CNN. This is Jim Sciutto talking about this, what's happening in Brazil.
And we're going to throw up some more of these images here. Those images of supporters of the losing candidate in the Brazilian presidential election, Jair Bolsonaro, storming the houses of government there, including where their assembly meets. You know, we used to talk about, and many folks still imagine this, and perhaps it's true to some extent, the U.S. exports democracy. But as you watch this and how it was seeded by the losing candidate in that election, who had a lot of rapport, one might say, with Donald Trump, is election denialism a new U.S. export?
So that's Jim Sciutto of CNN claiming that the U.S. exports democracy. Camila, you've reported firsthand from many countries where the U.S. has tried to, quote unquote, export democracy by overthrowing democracy, including Bolivia. So I'm wondering your thoughts on what Jim Sciutto said. It is too loud for now. All right, so we'll try to catch you in a few moments. Michael Fox, let me go to you. What do you make of that comment that the U.S. is now only for the first time exporting election denialism?
Well, that is the image, and that's what they've always said from Washington. That's the U.S. is the greatest democracy in the world, and we export our democracy everywhere. But of course, if you look at the number of coups the U.S. has held across, not just Latin America, but the entire world, that's just ridiculous. But that's the image that it has to give, right? That you have from kind of mainstream media and the Democratic Party and whatever else. I think there's a couple things to unpack. First off, it is really important to remember that the United States was spying, the NSA and whatnot, was spying on the Dilma Rousseff administration. That's the reason, if you remember back in the early teens, Dilma Rousseff canceled a visit to the United States to visit Obama because we found out about the spying against her government from the United States. So the spying from the United States has gone for a very long time.
And Dilma Rousseff, just to remind people, that was Lula's chosen successor.
That was his successor, Lula's former chief of staff, who won the election in 2010 and ruled until 2016, until, of course, she was ousted in the congressional coup. We know that the United States was working together with the car wash investigative team, the FBI. They had at least 18 different members who were working with that team, and they used it to tank Lula and to jail him. The U.S. was involved in Lula's jailing to keep him out of power in 2018. So we know that the United States has been involved in this type of thing. And of course, we know that the U.S. Backed the 1964 coup, right, against the then leftist president at that point. And if anyone wants a bit of a history lesson, you can check out Brazil on Fire, which talks about all the details of all these things that would happen. Now, it is interesting, absolutely interesting what we're talking about now, because it seems like the U.S. government is much more on board and much more aligned with Lula. And why is that? There's a couple of reasons. First off, Trump's foreign policy was not Trump. Bolsonaro's foreign policy was aligned not just with the U.S. government, but with Trump. It was Trump-centric, and it was whatever's good for Trump is good for Brazil. When Trump lost, he didn't really know what to do with Biden. He didn't know, how do my relationships work? And so Biden and the United States, in a lot of ways, is actually much better off with Lula. Lula's a Democrat. He's a negotiator. He's a diplomat. They actually feel like they can probably get a lot more from Lula they could possibly get from Bolsonaro, who kind of gave the U.S. and the rest of the region this kind of this bad image, right? They figure, oh, this is somebody that we can work with. So this is kind of the general image. Also, remember that the Senate actually came out and with pretty harsh statements in saying that, listen, we're only going to acknowledge and recognize the results of a democratic election in Brazil, which is crazy, but it's amazing that they actually did it. And that's actually really strong. Aaron, we would be having in a completely different conversation right now if Trump had been president. I think if Trump had been president, the situation in Brazil yesterday, the situation for the military in Brazil, I think would have been very, very different. Would have been much more complicated. So this is in part what we're seeing right now, in part kind of the coalition of forces that's playing out right now. So there is interest in Washington to keep to bring Lula in with the hopes that maybe they can tame Latin America, maybe tame the Latin American left. Remember, even back during the pink tide years, Lula was seen as the good government compared with the so-called the good left, right? Compared with, say, Hugo Chavez and Evo Morales and Rafael Correa, who were the more radical, socialism of the 21st century and whatnot. Yeah. So I think this is a little bit of what we're seeing right now, where Biden doesn't want to back Trump any more than he absolutely has to. And of course, Bolsonaro, where is he? He's in Florida. He's in Florida of all places.
Camila, do you have any thoughts on this? If you're able to reach us in a very noisy environment, great. Okay.
It's very noisy. I actually was right where we started. We thought that the march had ended, and those are just people that were lagging behind. But it seems like it was just a massive gap, and then it started up again. But what I wanted to say is there's this word in Spanish called respaldo, and they use it a lot. Maybe Mike, knows what I'm talking about here. But it's like a cross between respect and support. And Lula has received a lot of that sort of respaldo from people across the political spectrum in Latin America in terms of leadership. Obviously, presidents, but ex-presidents as well, from everything from the Grupo de Lima, the Lima group, obviously ALBA countries. They all saluted Lula and his win, CARICOM countries, and of course the most important and most influential leaders such as President Nicolas Maduro. And this is something that Washington is keeping an eye on, as well as many presidents and prime ministers from overseas were they were watching very closely the election, this electoral process, and for that reason, about 20 heads of state and government were here on January 1st for the inauguration, and all other countries, of course, sent their foreign ministers, vice presidents, and very high-ranking government officials in order to make sure that they start off on the right foot with Lula da Silva. He had so many appointments on that day that he couldn't possibly meet with the vast majority of those people, except, of course, the president. And that's because, people understand that this is it could potentially be some sort of superpower in our region. We talk about a multipolar world, but what's the other pole going to be? Like, on what side of the world? Are all the poles going to be China and Russia and a couple of other, large economies overseas? What is the pole in Latin America? Is it Venezuela latching on to one of their friends in Eurasia? I mean, what is the suggestion here? It is the case that, this country has a massive capacity to produce quite a lot. It's a huge producer of food, of meat specifically. And, the rest of the region wants to use this to their advantage. In the case of Bolivia, which is the next door neighbor, the possibilities are endless in terms of trade and cooperation.
All right, Michael Fox, any closing thoughts for us? It sounds like the U.S. is hoping it can co-opt Lula, it can tame him. And he did appoint, apparently, a vice president as his running mate who is pretty, who leans to the right. And I'm wondering if that was one of Lula's efforts to sort of appease the elite, not only in his own country, but also in the U.S. But at the same time, Lula has always had an independent foreign policy. He recently criticized the proxy war in Ukraine and basically faulted both sides, both Ukraine and Russia and NATO as well. And when he came into office, the markets dipped because of his vow to end poverty. So because Lula has a program of trying to end poverty, the markets fell because the markets don't like something like social spending to end poverty. So any closing thoughts you want to leave us with?
I would just say that, three things. First off, looking at where we are right now after the invasion of the Capitol, Supreme Court Justice Alexandre de Moraes, it's important to remember that for the last few years, he has been the thorn in the side of Bolsonaro and Bolsonaro supporters. Like, they have called for his death. They have rallied out in front of the Supreme Court to call for his ousting. He's received death threats from them. And that's because he's launched all these different investigations into, obviously the fake news, into the financiers of the anti-democratic protest. And this kind of ties back to what Camila was talking about. Because he's now going to be he's going to be doing that around this Brasilia invasion. And so that means he has the experience. In fact, just a few months ago, he was raiding the homes of 9 different pro-Bolsonaro businessmen who he had found to not only have financed anti-democratic protests, but were actually plotting potential coup scenarios on WhatsApp in support of Bolsonaro. So this is somebody who has the experience and who's going to be extremely harsh against what's happening right now. And he already has. This is the same man who's already declared 9 different measures. And who has, called for all the Bolsonaro encampments to be cleared. So this is good news. I think what we see going forward, which is really, really key, is this is a moment. What does Lula bring back? He brings back this possibility of hope. He's the great negotiator on a domestic platform, right? On a national platform, like you said. Yeah, he brought in Geraldo Alckmin. This is his former arch nemesis. Like, this is the guy who actually ran against Lula back in 2006. And he brought him into his team because he wanted to build a broad front, not just of political parties, not just the center and the center right, but also social movements, labor unions. He brought them all together to say, we are democracy, we are unity, and we are fighting dictatorship and the potential for dictatorship and authoritarianism. And that's exactly what we saw yesterday, was the potential for violence, hate, threats, authoritarianism. And that's why this moment is a moment of hope and potential right now for Brazil, because it means that those people who might have been, like I mentioned before, who might have been more aligned with Bolsonaro, that wanted to see Bolsonaro stay in power, but at this point don't want to see people ransacking Brasilia and don't want to see that type of politics, that type of authoritarian politics coming back into power, might be more than willing to side with Lula. And this is a moment that he has to bring even more people kind of into his coalition and really build this broad front. Obviously, about poverty alleviation, about lifting the poor, which is, tens of millions of people were lifted out of poverty in his first 8 years in power. Yeah. And this is what he's been talking about consecutively that he wants to do again. But also don't forget, during his time in power, he also lifted the capitalist class, and they made more money than ever as well, and business and whatnot. So he's not talking about cutting the kneecaps of the capitalist class themselves. He's talking about like lifting all votes. That's what he's always been talking about. So this is a moment of potential hope for Brazil to really kind of lift all boats, and for Lula of anybody else to bring the country together.
Camila, any final comments for us as we wrap?
It's also a moment for a potential crackdown. It's a moment to see how far the Lula administration is going to go to seek justice and to make sure that this doesn't happen again. So, we've seen this take place in Bolivia. Right now in Bolivia, there's some right-wing or far-right destabilization in the Department of Santa Cruz, led by one of the coup leaders himself. He's now in jail on pretrial detention, but a lot of destabilization has even taken place since he was arrested. We've seen the same thing in Venezuela. Venezuela did not crack down on the terrorists, on the guarimbas, in the various waves of violence that we saw there in 2014, even before that, but specifically in 2017. And that was a huge problem. A lot of problems were created out of that. The only 2 countries that have adequately cut down on right-wing violence, insurrection, destabilization attempts have been Cuba and Nicaragua. And Nicaragua, above all, has been attacked over and over by the media and even by alternative media and leftist organizations in the United States. So it's very important right now, because the one thing that is guaranteed in the next 4 years during Lula's administration is attempts at destabilization, attempts to undermine the government, his administration, undermine the institutions, attack the institutions. And so if that's the case, and we're talking about a situation where the right is radicalizing, and they're gaining support and they're receiving material support, perhaps from outside of Brazil, then it's time to hold all of these people responsible and not be soft on them, And right now, he has a very strong mandate, a lot of support both within the country and a lot of support outside of the country. He might actually round up a bunch of people, charge them, sentence them, and actually not be condemned as some sort of dictator, the way in which we see other countries do that. That's what we're going to be looking for.
All right. Camila Escalante, editor with Costa News and Latin America correspondent for Press TV, and Michael Fox, Brazil-based journalist, host of the podcast Brazil on Fire. Thanks so much to you both.
Thank you so much, Aaron and crew, and thank you for having me on with my good friend, Mike Fox.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Everybody, we're doing live stand-up comedy in Los Angeles in January and February in Los Angeles. And then we're going to Tempe, Palm Springs, Milwaukee, Minneapolis, Nashville. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for all those tickets and become a premium member while you're there.